Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our forums are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon, and we encourage you to attend. For more information about our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And today, I am very honored and excited to introduce our speaker, Margo Frasier. Margo Frasier is currently our police monitor here in Austin. She's also an attorney, a very experienced one, and she was also our sheriff of Travis County for a number of years. Very accomplished lady. She brings over 35 years of experience in criminal justice work to the city. And she's going to tell us about the office of the police monitor, her role and responsibilities, and their efforts basically to improve the relationship between police and the public. And the police monitor's office is where anyone can go and complain if they feel that they haven't been treated appropriately or respectfully by the police. The questions that she encounters focus on whether police are responding to all of our citizenry effectively and with respect and restraint and with fairness. How often and in what context is there likely to be a perception of excessive use of force? And what other recourse do citizens or communities have when they believe they may have been improperly treated by police? She's won numerous awards. So it's my pleasure to introduce Margo Frasier, and here she is.
Well, good morning. I head up the Office of the Police Monitor. The Office of the Police Monitor has been in existence in Austin since 2002. If you look back at the history of the office and its creation, it was created as a result of the fact that there were a number of problems of communication and trust between the police department and the community, particularly the police department and communities of color. The idea behind the office was to create a situation where there would be somebody, as I say, we're the watchers of the watchmen. And so, let's see, Mr. Linder just walked in, and there was, and I always tell folks that if you look back at our history, we had a couple of incidents that occurred in Austin. One is often referred to as the Cedar Street incident. And it's fitting that we're here the day after Valentine's Day. It rose out of a Valentine's Day party. And depending on whose perception and view of things, you either had some people that were having a Valentine's Day party in East Austin who asked for assistance from the police and wound up instead being victims of police brutality. Or if the other perspective is that there was this wild, out-of-control party that essentially turned into a riot. No matter whose view you may choose to take, what is clear was that it was a situation, it was something that quickly developed and became where there was a great deal of force used, and that there was a disturbance. There were some of the people who were attending the party and who were in the area who sustained injuries. There were police officers who sustained injuries. But it was, quite frankly, kind of systematic of the lack of trust that we had in this community, particularly between communities of color and the police department. So the office was formed. It has undergone a number of changes over the years. When the office originally was created, if you had a complaint about a police officer, you could come to the office, they would listen to you, and then they'd walk you down the hall, and you had to give your complaint actually to a police officer. And a lot of people felt intimidated by that. I hear stories from some of my staff members who have been there since the office was created, that there would often be a lengthy kind of preamble to the giving of the statement from the internal affairs investigator about how if the person lied, that they would be, subject to being filed on for perjury and these sorts of things, and they felt that some of them were, quite frankly, intimidation factors. As the office has progressed, now if a person has a complaint, we handle that entire process. Someone comes into our office, or we're part of the modern age now. We do things also by email and a little bit by what I call snail mail. That's usually with the folks who find themselves out in the jail system. But we have other ways that we're able to help people to be able to take their complaints and facilitate it. I have a couple of charts, and I will tell you our last report that we have out is the 2012 annual report, which within the next couple of weeks of 2013 will be out. And the reason why it takes a while, you're thinking, we're in 2015, is the fact that the report covers all the cases that were filed within the calendar year, and we still have some open cases from 2013. Usually it's because it's cases that have not been dealt with yet because, unfortunately, they involve a shooting, and the grand jury has not yet reviewed the case, and so the case hasn't been finished up and closed. But what we find, and I know it's going to be difficult, you're not going to really be able to see this, but I'm going to use it kind of a little prop here. What we have is a lot of people who call into our office. Approximately half of the people who call into our office, we get around 1,500 or so what we consider to be contacts into our office. Roughly half of those people, after they are able to have a conversation with a complaint specialist, that they go, oh, okay, now I understand. Because sometimes it is just a lack of understanding as to why, as I say, police do what police do. We don't excuse the behavior of the police, I want to be clear, but we try to help people understand because they'll be upset. And I think kind of surprisingly in today's day, we get a lot of calls from people who have perhaps gotten a citation, and they want to know why that officer gave them a ticket, because to them, the officer has the discretion not to give a ticket. Well, yes, but the officer has the discretion to give the ticket. And so sometimes I have to explain to people that filing a complaint is not going to result in their ticket being dismissed. They choose to go away. The other option that we have for people is that if someone wants to, instead of filing a formal complaint, wants to do what we call our supervisor referral, they can do that also, which allows them to speak directly to the officer's supervisor who looks into the matter and is usually helpful in reaching an understanding with the member of the public. The other group are as far as people filing formal complaints. If somebody files a formal complaint under state law, it has to be notarized. And so we will facilitate that. We will take the complaint. We will classify the complaint as far as if what the person says is true, what policy the person will have violated. In the past, when I got there, I've been there a little over 4 years now. When I got there, I think kind of a gotcha game was played in the fact that if the person, the kind of position taken by the police department at that time was that the complaint specialists really weren't supposed to help people figure out what policy it was, and so that the person was supposed to say what policy violation. And so it resulted a lot of times in people, as I would be willing to bet, one of those Valentine cookies in there at least, that there are very few of you who could tell me what the policy number is for the Austin Police Department on excessive use of force. Why would you know? Why would you understand the nuances of policy? What people usually know is I don't like how the interaction made me feel. I don't feel like I was treated appropriately. They don't know what the rule is, but what they know is it didn't make them feel good, that they didn't feel respected, that they felt that the officer didn't behave appropriately. So we figure out what the potential policy violation is. We make a recommendation as to what level of offense it would be, and I will tell you sometimes we say that we don't feel that there has been a policy violation from the beginning. But we take the complaint, and then a very important role of our office is to monitor or oversee the investigation of the complaint.
Now, I don't know. Most of the time, I know that members of the public, and I know that the people who particularly who are probably here and who are involved at this church, I know you're very civic-minded, and so you know that every time that there is a shooting, an officer-involved shooting, there's always some level of press coverage on it, some more than others. And if you'll watch the news, you'll usually see during if they happen to have any sort of pictures or clips, people out at the investigative side, you'll notice people will tell me, "Oh, I didn't know if you were there, and then I saw your hair." Because I figured out that this white hair stands out in the world. Or they will see me at the press conference in the vicinity of the chief of police. Now, let me tell you, it doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with what the chief is saying. It doesn't mean that I agree that the chief is even being accurate. But the reason I am there is because I think it's important for the public to understand that there is somebody there from the very beginning watching to make sure that the investigation is conducted fairly and openly. When you see, if you think about some of the incidents that have occurred, particularly lately, it's been obviously in the news a great deal. A lot of questions, even like in the Ferguson matter, a lot of questions from the very beginning about the way the investigation was conducted. Some issues as far as, what happened in the placement of what happened with the duty belt that the officer involved was wearing. And so my role is I get the call. I'm on the list from dispatch as they're going through the calls. I'm about the second or third person they usually call. I get up, and these things, as I say, seldom happen on a beautiful, good weather day in the daylight. Somehow it's always in the evening or, in either extremely cold or extremely hot weather. Somehow they don't ever seem to happen on like the beautiful day we're probably going to have today. But I get up, I go to the scene, or if I'm not available, my assistant goes to the scene, and we're there from the very beginning to make sure, quite frankly, please don't take from this an inference that I'm saying that shenanigans would occur, but we're there to make sure nothing does occur, that the investigation is fair and open and complete. And we're there every step of the way. We attend every interview in an internal affairs case. We're able to ask questions. In most situations, there are some exceptions. But we're able to ask questions, which is something new that we were able to get in the last agreement with the Austin Police Association. We make recommendations as far as who should be interviewed. Now, I will tell you, the police department doesn't have to go along, but sometimes we have some pretty healthy discussions. Sometimes that discussion winds up at, being at my level between the chief of police and me if there's a disagreement among our staff. But our job is to make sure that things are looked at. In the end, I can make a recommendation as to whether or not I think a charge should be sustained. I will tell you, I hadn't been police monitor for 4 months. And we had an investigation that I had encouraged the police department to look beyond the initial facts of the case. An officer had gotten into some trouble, and I'd asked the question of where was he before he got in trouble, because he was highly intoxicated and had an automobile accident. And so we did delve into it further, found out that he was at a party with a great number of other officers, and the case wound up being greatly expanded. In that case, I made a recommendation for discipline for several different officers, and the Austin Police Association filed a grievance and said that I had overstepped my bounds by making a recommendation on whether charges should be staying in discipline, and said the only cases I could do that, we were trying to say I really couldn't do it all, and only the panel could do it on shooting cases. and their grievance was denied. And so it set the precedent for the fact that I could, in fact, make recommendations on discipline in every case. Most of the time that is done quietly. The public never knows about it because of some other aspects of law out there. But I take that role very seriously to make sure that proper discipline is administered. So what do our complainants look like? You know, one of the things I think that is striking in Austin is that the fact that when we look at our complainants, we compare our complainants, what our complainants look like in all of our analysis that we do. We compare it not so much to census data because, quite frankly, hopefully, 6-year-olds aren't having contact with the police department in most cases. So we use, the closest thing we can come up with is to use, and because the statistics are available, or some of the data that's available for voting age. Because that being 18, it more closely resembles who it is that the police department would come in contact with. And so we compare. And so one of the comparisons we do is what's the race of the people who come to us? And what we find is that Caucasians represent around 37%, and this is pretty consistent over the last couple years, although I expect when we release our 2013 report, we'll actually see a pretty significant increase in the number of Latinos that are coming to our office. But Caucasians don't file near as many complaints as they are represented in the public. Hispanics or Latinos have historically filed less. I don't necessarily think, quite frankly, that means that they're all that happy. I think part of that had to do with some issues having to do with language barriers and some concerns, your topic next week, about immigration laws. And so we've done a great deal of outreach. Every piece of our literature, we make sure that we have it available in Spanish. And one of the things that we do is that we tell people that we're not going to ask about their immigration status instead of leaving them wondering whether or not that's the case. So we've seen an increase. But the most telling thing is, to me, in a great deal, is that 27% in 2002 of our complaints came from our African American members of our community, when in reality nowadays they make up roughly, depending on which statistics you look at, somewhere between 6 and 8% of our community. So African Americans are greatly overrepresented. Why? Well, I would suggest there's a couple reasons. One reason is that I think that the office, in its original mission, that it was an office that was seen as being created to provide a safe harbor for African Americans to come to. I think also that there are folks within the African American community, such as the NAACP, a lot of the African American ministers and other folks who know of our existence and tell people, because they'll come in our office. Because one of the things we started doing recently, I said, I want to figure out how people know we exist. I want to ask them so we can figure out where our efforts are working and where perhaps they're not working. And a lot of people tell us that they've been referred to us. I think the other reason why is that, quite frankly, that African Americans feel that they are treated in a disparate manner by the police department. And so one of the things that we have done is that the Austin Police Department publishes what they call a racial profiling report every year. And they come back, and it always says, with the conclusion that somehow the result of the feeling that we're not racially profiling. So one of the things that I wanted to look at, because a lot of the cases that we hear and get are ones that have to do with people being stopped by the police and searched by the police. So we did some statistics looking at the traffic stops that are out there by ethnicity. And so we've been doing this, and we began it really pretty much after I got there in 2011. We started doing it. We did it again in 2012, and we're preparing it for 2013. And I will tell you, when the report comes out, what you're going to find is is it hasn't gotten better. So if you are, so for example, one assumes, start with the assumption that no ethnic group drives more in conformance with the law than any other ethnic group. And that's what studies actually show. White folks don't drive better than black folks. Black folks don't drive better than brown. This sort of thing. So what we looked at was the number of traffic stops. And what we found was that Caucasians roughly mirrored their population. It was right about 51% of the population is Caucasian as far as that voting age. 53% of the population is roughly 51% of the traffic stops. So a little less represented. But when you look at African Americans, they make up 7.5% of the population, but they made up 13% of the stops. So they have almost a 1 in 2 chance, where all other races have basically about 1 in 4. The Latinos, it's roughly in comparison. What we found is the other largest, fastest growing minority group in Austin is the Asian population. And they're underrepresented. Now, I will tell you, I have some concerns about the manner in which data is collected. That I think that that when in doubt, officers sometimes just write down, for Asians, often write down white. I know that I've had some, there's also a category for Middle Eastern. I know I've had a couple complaints from people who are Indian by heritage, and when they looked at the report later on, or the ticket later on, it classified them as Middle Eastern. And that is, they're upset about it because they say that's not what I am. So you have some misidentification. And I will tell you, my own lovely 22-year-old daughter recently experienced a speeding ticket, which took her a little while to tell Mom about. But one of the things, for those of you who have been in Austin a long time and probably watched her grow up, couple of folks here in your congregation saw her probably right after she was born, her first trip to church. And she was 3 when I was elected sheriff. She's now 22, but she is biracial. And as I always say to the world, she's African American. And she told me, she goes, "Mom, the cop thought I was white," and that's what the designation on the ticket was. And I thought, it led me to wonder how often that sort of mistake perhaps is made. All right, but even more importantly, and back when Senator Rodney Ellis was working on the racial profiling statute, one of the things I told him was that my concern was often not the stop itself, but what happened after the stop. My belief that you may very well be true in some cases, that you don't know the race or ethnicity of the person when you stop them. Although I would suggest to you that I can make a pretty good guess if I'm in certain parts of Austin. If I am at Far West in Greystone, I can tell you that the person I stop is most likely to be white. They're going to be Caucasian, maybe Asian. All right? If I stop somebody at 11th, the corner of 11th and Rosewood, there's a pretty higher likelihood that that person's going to be a person of color. If I stop somebody in Dub Springs, again, it's a lot more likely the person's to be someone of color. So there are some of those factors to it. But, to try to get away from the, I couldn't tell what they were, I'm just enforcing laws, what I want to know is what happened afterwards. And so we found like I said, the 2013 statistics mirror the same sort of behavior. Is that remember I said that Caucasians account for 51% of the traffic stops. They only account for 32% of the searches. African Americans count, remember, 13% of the traffic stops. They account for 24% of the searches. Latinos account for 31% of the traffic stops. They account for 42% of the searches. So what you see is, just if you what's your probability of being searched if you were stopped? If you are Caucasian, it's 1 out of 19. And I wish that, and we keep trying to get better data from the police department, because I think if you took and applied an age and gender aspect to some of this data, it perhaps would be even more striking. I don't know about the rest of us, that, those of us who are out here that are, let's say, past the age of which we can get that AARP card. We're not being asked, particularly if we're white, we're not being asked if we got any hand grenades, bazookas, machetes, that kind of goofy line that somewhere along the line somebody taught officers to ask because it's supposed to get you chuckling. And so you go, of course not. And then the next question is, mind if I look? That question's not even being asked of older Caucasians in most cases. I'm not sure that that's an accurate statement when you talk about older people of color, particularly males. But if you're African American in this community, you stand a 1 in 6 chance. If you're Latino, it's a 1 out of 9 chance of being searched if you're stopped. And so what I've tried to say is that actually causes people to feel as if they are being singled out. Now, we look at some data. One of the changes that was made by the Austin Police Department, I was glad to see it made. We encouraged the office, I encouraged our citizen review panel, encouraged the police department. I know that others, like Texas Civil Rights Project, the NAACP, a lot of people were part of this, encouraged the police department to change their policy on consent searches, to make it so that some people are actually under the law. A police officer doesn't have to tell you that you don't have to consent to a search, that you have that right. And guess what? They didn't. And so one of the things we said was that they should require officers to tell people that and actually tell them in writing and have them sign in writing. And so what we've seen since that change is the number of consent searches has gone down. But one of the things we also look at is the cases of when officers said that I had probable cause to search, how often do they find anything? And one of the things that I have expressed concerns about is the level of understanding and training of police officers on what constitutes probable cause. And I guess the good news is it's pretty much the same across the board. But in 2012, we found in roughly 2/3 of the cases, the officer said they had probable cause, yet they found nothing by way of contraband, which tells me that a lot of citizens and residents of this community were being subjected to search, when in reality there was no reason to. It was just a fishing expedition. And so we've, time and time again, will continue to make recommendations that the police department figure out if there are some officers who have a more serious problem with not finding things and do some retraining of them. So our job is to take complaints, to monitor the complaints. Our job is also to facilitate the operation of the Citizen Review Panel, who I think is a very important group in this community. It's 7 individuals that are appointed actually by the city manager. They serve as volunteers. A citizen or a resident who doesn't like the way the outcome of their case can take their case to them as far as if they filed a complaint. But one of the most important roles I think they play is that every time if an Austin officer discharges their firearm intending to strike another human being, even if they don't hit them, the case is reviewed by by the Citizen Review Panel, and they are able to provide a perspective to the police department and also, quite frankly, to city management on the citizen's view of whether or not that use of force was justified And they look at, and I've encouraged them to not only look at the moment when the shot is fired, but how you wound up getting into that situation. Because a lot of times the use of force at the moment that it's used may be justified, but you can look at it and tell if this officer had done something different, or if, quite frankly, in some cases the panel has been very vocal on the lack of treatment and available resources for people with mental health. If this person had been able to get the mental health treatment they needed, perhaps the officer would have never been in that situation, had to use that force. But the other thing in which I continue to stress and will continue to look at is the way that officers are deployed. We have a relatively young police force, and it's going to get younger because they're adding more and more officers. Plus, a lot of the more senior officers are now eligible for retirement. So one of my concerns is when I'm looking at who we're seeing, because what we know is that the group that gets the highest number of complaints are the very young officers. They're the officers with 1 to 3 years experience because, quite frankly, they don't really, all they have is that little tool bag that they give them at the academy. Unfortunately, often they don't have the added skill of being able to communicate and de-escalate situations. And so we have looked at, one of the things I've looked at is where officers are being deployed and have expressed concerns, and quite frankly, I'll continue to express concerns about the fact that we see the highest number of inexperienced officers being assigned to the areas that I, quite frankly, think require the greatest number of experience. You know, so they're the officers that are being assigned to, like, the Central East Command, the Southeast Command. So where often the highest number of complaints arise, and of course, part of it's, because of these officers being so experienced. So the inexperienced officers are being assigned there, but also in conjunction with being teamed with very few experienced officers. So if you want to see where the most experienced officers are, quite frankly, you can look around here. The most experienced officers are assigned to Northwest, Central West, and Southwest. That's where the experienced officers are, where I would suggest to you that the ability to, if we assume that they're more valuable, and you certainly pay them more money, I mean, the whole compensation plan is based on the fact that with experience you become a better officer. I would suggest that some of those officers, they need to be more evenly spread across this community. That ends my prepared remarks. I've got a couple other things with me when we finish. I've got some copies of our brochures that we give out to folks. I brought a few copies of the ones in Spanish. I'm proud of the fact that this last year, in fact, is the first year we actually, I'd read it to you, but I can't, but it's translated into Mandarin. And our next one we're working on is to have a pamphlet in Vietnamese. So I'm trying to really expand and at least make basic information available to more members of our community. I also have a couple of our brochures that we have a mediation program. And I got a couple of these. We started on a new thing. In fact, we used it this last year at Juneteenth instead of when we were in the parade, instead of just handing out candy. We're coming up with some information cards, some of the most common sort of things. This one is talking to a supervisor, so it lets the public know because I think, I will tell you, when people ask me, what do you tell your daughter? I tell my daughter, be respectful, but the moment you feel like this encounter is starting to go south, the magic words are, I'd like a supervisor out here, because it tends to change the behavior and the tone of the interaction. I've got some of those with me. And I'm looking very much forward to questions and discussion.
My first question is, in what way could your office be helpful to a woman who is dating or married to an APD police officer and is experiencing domestic violence?
We get cases like that where we have had spouses of officers, sometimes, quite frankly, both spouses are officers, who have or experienced domestic violence or some sort of where they feel that the officer may not be as severe as actual violence, but they may feel that the officer is misusing his or her position by, like, they've broken up, and every time somebody parks in her driveway, and the officer's running the license plate to figure out who it is. They can call us. We certainly do handle those sorts of complaints. I will tell you that it is an area that we're extremely sensitive to. I used to, at one time earlier in my life, go around and give a series of lectures around the country about when the batterer wears a badge. So I'm very aware of the fact that officers are in a position that if they are prone to violence, that they feel empowered by the fact that they are officers. So tell them to call us, and we will help them through the process. I will say that the police department has done a good job, I feel, but I've seen an improvement in the fact that when there is some misbehavior going on, that we've said, this officer needs to be told, it needs to stop now, and while the investigation is, going on, so that, because one of the things people are always afraid is some retaliation. But they can certainly call us, and even if, well, I will tell you, we sometimes have people who call and say, I still don't feel safe, but we will work to make sure we know about the other resources in the community as far as safe place and things like that, and we've worked with victims.
Clearly there's a need for specialized training of police in handling people with mental illness. It's easy to misinterpret their behavior as just resistance. Would you elaborate a little bit?
Yes, and I think that, the training of officers, as far as several years back, there often what will happen is that the legislature will recognize a problem and will, it takes them a while sometimes, but they will realize there's a problem, and so they will actually mandate training. And so one of the things they mandated that every police officer be trained in what's called crisis intervention training. I have suggested, and I feel strongly, that the more training that officers get on dealing with folks who are mentally ill, or quite frankly just how to deal with people who aren't happy. And so there has been an increase in the number of officers who have the training, but I would suggest that I feel it's a worthwhile investment for this community to have our police officers have as much training, quite frankly, about how to deal with special populations and de-escalation techniques. That's as important as teaching them how to shoot that gun, if not more so.
The problem of maldistribution of experienced officers, I wonder if, as you get more experience, you can pick your zone. Is that what the problem is?
That is a lot of it. Although I will tell you that there's some shift bidding aspects. Austin, although they have an agreement with the Austin Police Association, it is not extremely restrictive as far as being able to make assignment of officers. But yes, one of the things that winds up, as you can imagine, working in a patrol car on the night shift is not on whatever side of town, but particularly a lot of folks would say although there are some officers who say, I want to be where things are hopping. I don't want to sit for hours and hours and wait for the next call. So part of it is preference of officers, but I would suggest that one of the things that needs to happen is perhaps there need to be some incentives to try and keep officers over there. Similar thing we see, quite frankly, we see it in our schools. I think there have to be things worked out, but I think it's a serious issue that needs to be addressed.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. So the data that you get, does it come from the feds? Does APD submit it up to like the federal level and that comes back to you, or do you have access to local databases at APD? And then also, does the data have the specific officer granularity in it, blinded or not, where you can identify back to Mr. Acevedo specific officers who may be underperforming relative to their peers?
The answer is yes and no. We have most of our data comes directly from some of it comes from our own database as far as our complainants, looking at our complainants, who our complainants are. Some of the data, particularly a lot of the racial profiling things, we have to get from the Austin Police Department. One of my concerns I'll be addressing this in the very near future. One of my concerns is that the law was changed. The initial racial profiling law that we had here in Texas, my sense is that over time it has become watered down. Police departments are no longer required to keep the racial profiling data. For example, they're not required to report to the states on pedestrian stops. Well, the things that you see in New York with the stop and frisk have to do with pedestrians. They don't have to do with people in cars. And while there may not be a lot of stop and frisk going on in this neighborhood, there is a great deal of stop and frisk going on in the city of Austin. And so I think that we need to have, that data needs to be kept and needs to be made available to the public, not just to us, but I think in a manner of transparency. The most recent change that occurred was the state said that if you stop somebody and at the end of the encounter no citation, arrest was not made or citation was not given, that data did not have to be reported. We get a lot of complaints from citizens. We hear from people that say the officer stopped me, they searched my car, they didn't find anything, and they said, "It's your lucky day, I'm going to let you go." I mean, when's the last time anybody in here's been arrested for the fact that you didn't signal a lane change far enough? Or you stopped in front of the stop line? I would suggest that for the majority of you, you've never experienced that behavior. My concern is that those are officers' behavior could potentially be hidden because of the fact of that. And so we're always advocating for having greater access to all of the data within the Austin Police Department. I quite frankly don't like to have to explain why it is I want data. Sometimes I'm just curious, and it may turn out that there's nothing there, but I think that part of our role is to be able to actually review the data.
We have a question from Nelson Linder, who's the president of the Austin NAACP.
There are issues right now about shootings all over the country. I think the data that you gave a while ago about the incidences that we don't look at, in many ways tell us what's going on, but we don't check the data. How can we take our research and make it more meaningful to the public? And I'll stop there.
Can you repeat?
How can we take our data and make it more meaningful to the public? A lot of folks don't know that these stops are indicators of future problems. Yeah. If you can address some of the stops, you can prevent some of the violence.
Yes, I agree. I think that the data, one of the things that we have had when we have presented data that showed the discrepancy, for example, in the stops, what we often hear is the idea of, well, that's because we're concentrated and people want us in their neighborhoods. And I'm like, I don't think people want folks being singled out and treated to what some folks view as being to be harassing behavior. I think that I'm hopeful that with our new city council, with our new structure of our city council, that there will be an increased emphasis placed on it. I think that what happens sometimes when you have, and let me say, lots of members of the prior council I consider to be personal friends. But when you have a large system where everybody kind of comes from the same area, no one is paying attention to the data. And so I am hopeful. One of the things that I have talked to my staff about doing with this coming years and kind of going forward is not to just look at things in terms of APD's, kind of districts, but also look in terms perhaps at more of the districts of the council members. So I'm hopeful that there's going to be greater attention paid to it. I think also that one of the things that having groups such as this for people to become informed and to speak up, things, we've made a lot of progress in this community, but we're not going to make progress in this community, quite frankly, until other folks are concerned about it. I found it very telling in a recent Supreme Court argument. They were having a discussion about traffic stops, okay? This very sort of issue, the idea of pretext. And our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shared that he had never been stopped on a traffic stop by a police officer. Now, I think, and then there was some response, particularly from Justice Sotomayor, who said, well, let me tell you, because part of it had to do with the fact of her experience of representing people in criminal matters and also being a criminal judge. There is a different experience. And what happens is that you have people who immediately dismiss people's statements. Think of all the backlash that the mayor of New York City got because he talked about the fact that he had concerns about his son, who is biracial, about his treatment. You would have thought that he had called every police officer in this country a KKK robe-wearing racist, and he didn't. But I think we have to have that conversation, and quite frankly, I think that the people in Austin have to understand. There was a recent NPR report that was talking about the decline of African Americans in this community. And it's real, folks. I mean, there are real numbers there. And the number two reason, first one was the idea of property tax and the expense of living here. Well, I'd suggest that affects every aspect of this community. But the second reason given was the fact of treatment by the police. Now, I will tell you, it doesn't matter whether that's true or not, as far as whether or not there is mistreatment. There is a perception that there is, and people's perception goes a long way influencing what their behavior is. Number three reason was, and I think that's the reason why you saw a lot of people move from particular East Austin. They just kind of moved up the interstate to Pflugerville. Had to do with the quality of schools in East Austin. That people were trying to position themselves to be in a place where their children could have a better education. But this community, we're thriving, but it's very bothersome to me. And I make no apology for the fact, I will say, I want my child, when she graduates, she's not going to school here in the city of Austin, but when she graduates, I want my baby to come home. I don't need grandchildren anytime soon. But when I have them, I want them to be raised in this city. I want them close to grandma. And so, but to have that happen, this needs to be a community that is a welcoming community for people of all colors in this community.
Yes, I'm curious about what you think about cameras with the police, whether it be it the Peaceful Streets Project, whether it's filming them, or the body cameras that some cops may wear. Okay.
Citizens have a right to film the police. There have been now court cases. So the citizens have a right to do it. I would suggest that in doing it, that there are a few sorts of kind of guidelines that people should use. For one, you shouldn't actually, get up there so that you become a distraction to the officer because you're so close and on the scene. But in the same way, I've certainly seen situations where officers, they're the ones that allow themselves to be distracted by the person who's filming. But certainly people have a right to film. As far as the cameras on the officers, I'm a proponent of having that, but I do think that there are some things that we need to work out, and part of it has to do actually, I'm not so concerned, I must tell you, when officers go, well, I won't get a private moment during the day, and I'm like, well, okay, sorry about that, but that's not, they're not going to run 10 hours a day or however long the shift is. For one, battery life doesn't work that way. But I do think that there's some privacy issues to be dealt with. There's some questions under Texas law as far as open records. At the point where that becomes a record of the police department, can anybody come in and request it? So, for example, take the domestic violence situation. The officer's having a conversation with the person he believes to be the victim of the domestic violence, is having a conversation. Well, when the case, is a form of, quite frankly, intimidation, will somebody be able to get that recording? What sort of use will be able to be made of it? So I do think that there are issues to be worked out, but the public expects increased transparency.
Yes, I'd like to see if you could comment a little more on the various categories of complaints that you're getting, maybe a Pareto of the top categories of complaints.
Okay. The complaint we get most often is that officers are rude. And that's what it really comes back to. And when I speak to young cadets, one of the things I tell them is if you will learn how to treat people respectfully, even when you're not necessarily getting that in return. And that's the hard part, right? As you can imagine, in your encounter with someone, if you walked up to someone and you said, "Good day, sir," and he goes, "Good day, sir," well, you know what? That's going to go pretty well. If you walked up to someone and said, "Good day, sir," and he goes, expletive you, our human inclination would be to, oh, yeah? Well, So officers, and often it's an in-between sort of behavior. But so one of the things we see is that when somebody walks up, the officer walks up the car and the person says, "What did you stop me for?" And the officer said, "You ran that stop sign." "No, I didn't. I saw you. I didn't run that stop sign." Next thing you know, the officer's like, "Step out of the car." And they're cuffing them and they're patting them down and they're making them go sit where they used to make them sit on the curb. Now they make them sit on the push bumper of the police car, which quite frankly often is very hot because the engine's running on the darn thing. And so, we get a lot of complaints of rudeness. We got also cases having to do with the person feels that they've been racially profiled. And that's a difficult case to prove because of the fact of the person, and again, it's one of these kind of things where that's the person's perception, and so I think it's important. And so we wind up looking at the officer's track record and what their behavior is, and not only who they're ticketing, but who it is they're choosing to search or they're choosing to handcuff and this sort of thing. But that's the main thing. It has to do with just ability to talk and communicate respectfully with the public, or at least the public's perception.
One of them is, you said you could be called any time. Does that mean somebody could call your what number does one call to get that call through? Can it be at night? Can it be somebody who's, say, I'm being arrested for something, to ask you a question about my rights? And the second question I have is about community policing.
We have on our brochures, and I tell people we try to make our website very easy to find, which is simply austinpolicemonitor.com. You can also access austinpolicemonitor.com. You can also access through the city's website. There's a link, and we advocated and finally got a link from the police department also that you could access ours. You can also call our office, which is 512-974-9090. I will tell you, we don't have the staff to man the office 24/7. So we're there 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. What I tell people is that if you have a situation where there's a severe case of police misconduct, to call 311, or if it is an emergency situation, and they need to call 911 and tell them that they need a police supervisor out to the scene. You had a question about community policing?
We have about 1.5 minutes, so go ahead.
That was one of the big complaints in the case in Ferguson. That I mean, I don't know if they have.
Yes.
If they have that, but it sure didn't sound like they had community policing.
Well, I would agree with you. I don't think Ferguson had community policing, and they didn't have any sort of civilian oversight. One of the things that, and I wish, I know that Mr. Nelson, his time is valuable, and he had some other things to go to. But one of the things that happened in this community when the Ferguson verdict was going to come out, I reached out to members of the community, including the president of the NAACP and some other community members, and said, you know, we need to have dialogue and talk about how we're going to handle the situation in Austin. And I had those same sort of conversations with the police department, and the police chief was having them with community members also. You know, one of the differences in Austin was that there were people who gathered at the police station to protest, and they were protesting. They were maybe protesting against Austin Police Department, but they were protesting the events in Ferguson. I commend the Austin Police Department that they not only didn't overreact, they reacted appropriately. The group decided impromptu. They didn't have a parade permit and all the other sort of things you have to get in Austin, because frankly, you couldn't have gotten one because you didn't know when the indictment was, or non-indictment was going to come down. But they escorted the group to the Capitol. They didn't attempt to quell the exercise of freedom of speech. And I also commend the people who were protesting, because they also used great restraint and respectfulness also. And so I think the reason we have flare-ups in this community when there is an incident, but I think the reason that it doesn't turn into that sort of situation is because of the relationships that are already there.
Unfortunately, we have to stop. Thank you for your efforts to ensure responsible and responsive policing. Margo Frasier.